Hello, my name is Susanne Evans and welcome to the ChangeStories podcast. This is a podcast for people who are interested in creating change, whether that is within organisations or for individuals. In each podcast episode, I will have a conversation with someone about their work to share their story. Each story and conversation will provide you with ideas and inspiration for your own organisation or for you personally. To find out more about each episode, including further reading, and to share your change stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the Change Stories podcast. My guest today is Steve Hearsum. Steve, it's so great to have you here.
Likewise.
Steve is a consultant, supervisor and coach, and his approach to client work is based on creating the conditions for useful discomfort in service of learning. He's the author of a new book out in March 2024 entitled No Silver Bullet, Bursting the Bubble of the Organisational Quick Fix, which looks at how unconscious patterns of shame and anxiety drive leaders to seek simple solutions and quick fixes for complex challenges. It also considers their relationship with the many purveyors of silver bullet solutions. Steve's work focuses on building change capability in organisations with an emphasis on two things. Firstly, helping clients develop leadership practice through a deeper understanding of how they show up and the impact they have. Secondly, supporting internal and external consultants and change agents develop their practice in the context of being at the centre of change, which is often where they find themselves. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today. For one, we've been talking to each other for a good few years about all this stuff. But two, I think you're probably the person that I've referenced most in some of the other podcast conversations I've had. So I'm really thrilled to actually have you here in the flesh.
Oh, I feel to be flattered. I always feel slightly, yeah, that's lovely to hear. Yeah. Although it could be, having said that, I'm assuming it's nice things. You could have been saying, have you heard about this numpty? So, you know.
No, it's all nice things. I think because when we first started speaking, which must be 3 or 4 years ago now, the concept of the book that at that point you were planning and writing just really struck with me, and I've been lucky enough to read an early copy of it too, and it's just wonderful. And I think anyone who's worked in consulting, I know when I read it, there was like a wry smile on my face. I kept chuckling at all these things that I recognised, but also that kind of recognition like, oh my goodness, I was part of this and still am, still a consultant, but hopefully working in a different way. But that idea of being part of the problem was really interesting to me to find out more about.
It's funny you say that. I think that I've had several people say similar things, this kind of sense of seeing themselves in it, that wry smile, that recognition, that knowing that I am part of this dance, is, I think, quite a common response I've picked up from people who've read early drafts of it.
And we'll talk about the book a lot today, but are you hoping with what you've written and the work that you're doing that it will create a change in practice, both from consultants but also from people hiring consultants? Is that your aim or not?
People at points have said to me, who are you writing it for? You know, what are you hoping will happen? And I've thought, I'll be really honest. At the beginning, when I started writing this, I didn't know who was writing it for other than myself. I knew it was something I had to get off my chest. You know, I had the energy for it. What then became clear to me was, it felt to me like there was something here that was going on that we needed to think more deeply about and understand, and that we needed to actually just simply start talking about. Because whilst there are conversations about, you know, the efficacy and efficacy of consulting and consultants, there are conversations about how organisations and leaders make decisions. They tend, to my mind, to happen in separate spaces. They don't tend to happen where we look at it and go, well, what are we all co-creating together? What's my relationship with this process? And the bit I think is most uncomfortable is if you do say, for example, as a consultant, whether you're in a large professional services firm or a small independent or a sole trader, to really ask yourself the question, you know, when am I not as ethical as I like to think I am? Requires more than a pinch of humility. You know, it really requires you to be willing to actually look at bluntly your own shit and in your own shadow. And if I just give you one example of why I think this is not as easy as it may appear. I reference it in the book. There's a very good BBC radio series from last year called The Magic Consultants. It's 5 episodes, 15 minutes. Very good. last episode, and holding in mind they had the chief executive of the Management Consulting Association as one of their interviewees, who at no point really ever says there's a fundamental problem ethically in consulting. It's all very, very positive. And then the presenter says something very simple in the fifth episode. It says, we invited 6 of the largest consulting and professional services firms in the UK to either comment or participate in this programme. They either didn't respond or declined. And he doesn't say anything else. And that, to me, is a fractal of the lack of a wider conversation. The issue is not, do all consultancies do evil? Do they all do good? Of course, there's a mix of them, in big and small. The problem is there's the unwillingness to even enter into an inquiry. And it's actually, to go back to your question, what I want out of it now is I really hope that people engage with the questions that I'm posing. If they disagree with me or they don't like the book in terms of its style, that's absolutely fine. But I guess if I was to challenge anybody listening, well, how am I wrong in key aspects of my underlying hypothesis? Because I'm struggling to see how I am.
I think that's true. Certainly my reading of it was it felt right. It felt true to what I have experienced, both as a consultant and, I've been in that big four space for 10 years as an independent, but also observing things that have happened in organisations that I now work with as a small consultancy and much more on my own terms, but some of their interactions with some of the bigger consultancies, I continue to watch with my mouth hanging open, frankly, because it's shocking. And you're right, there are great people in all of these organisations, but also terrible people. But the underpinning problem, I think, is exactly how you identify it. It's ethics and how that plays out in practice. And the big issue, and you talk about it in the book a lot, but also in the intro we just talked about, that kind of dependency that it creates. Consultancies like clients to be dependent on them, and some clients are looking for that quick fix for their problem, aren't they, which they feel they can't solve themselves. I don't know how we get out of that as a dilemma.
It's actually a philosophical question as much as a learning question. I mean, it talks about what's your philosophy of learning, period. What's your philosophy and your pedagogy when it comes to the entire education system? How are we teaching kids to think and to problem solve as they enter the workplace? And I mean, something really simple. I'll give you just one. It popped into my head, so I'll share it. Now, I have a real issue with the linguistic construct that we have, which starts right at a young age. It started with my daughter, and I would always challenge it with my wife and daughter, which is, "Oh, you've made me feel." And in that construct, we have an example, a kind of a fractal of how we are brought up in such a way to give up power and to also abdicate at some level personal responsibility for our own experience. It also is at its worst, I don't mean this in an unkind way, it's kind of the laziness of that, the quickness to move to that position means you have to, you eschew all responsibility for your own sense making. That's not to say that some people don't behave in a way that is utterly abhorrent, and it is incredibly difficult not to feel certain things in response to them. And some of the things we say that we feel because others have made us feel them are a little bit like a 10-year-old in the playground. And that's not really the response that you want to have if you're a 35 or 45 or 55-year-old senior leader in an organisation or a consultant working with them.
No, that's true. And I think we all still have those thoughts, don't we? But it's about recognizing them when they happen. I can remember my coach correcting me, not correcting me, but kind of pointing out to me when I said, I feel like, when I was talking about something that had happened, and I feel like this is why that's happening. And she said to me, that's a story you're telling yourself. What is it that's happening in reality? And I think it's having that awareness. You will still think those things, but when those thoughts pop into your head, it's challenging them and thinking, well, how could you do it in a different way?
But this is not easy work, and I kind of want to make this really clear. I had an experience recently, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, so I'll give you the nugget of my observation just to respect confidentiality. but creating the conditions for a group of senior leaders to actually have the conversations that they've been telling you that they need to have. So they acknowledge they need to have different conversations, and scaffolding an approach and creating a container that is sufficient to hold the anxiety that would arise. And in that moment, seeing a proportion of the group really up for it, another proportion of the group bricking themselves, but going for it, and then a kind of rump or kind of a tail end. I don't know how long the tail is. What it felt like a bit like was, this is my story, but I would really much prefer you gave us a model that will explain how we do this, but then we can go away and not do it. And that to me is this phrase about doing the work proper. I can't remember the moment who it is. It's in the book, but it's this idea that this is the work proper. It is not easy.
Yeah, I'm really struck with your work about that word discomfort. It's in your introduction, but also I was noodling around on your website, and that idea of agitating and being uncomfortable, I think is quite interesting, because it's a place where we need to get to do the work, as you say. I butt up against it a lot in my work in organisation change, because that is a place where a lot of people feel uncomfortable all the time. But it seems to be something that people in organisations, particularly leaders, try and avoid. And I think it's a real challenge to get people to go into that space. And I don't know why it is. I feel like sometimes, I'm telling my own story now, I think sometimes there's this construct that as a leader you need to have all the answers, and going somewhere where they don't is something that people fear, for fear of exposure. I don't know if that's your experience.
Well, but also we, as the rest, don't let them.
No, yes, quite.
It's how good at following are we? It's a polarity. It's leading and following. It's you kind of, as a follower, you can't have it both ways. On the one hand, you're not going to get perfection, and on the other hand, at some point, you're going to have to let them lead if you do actually sign up to the fact that Susanne is the leader of this organisation. And then get into conversations at the appropriate moments when something is not quite right in that dynamic. But what I notice in organisations is how hard it is for example, leaders to actually simply acknowledge they don't know. How often do you hear a senior leader when they're asked a question go, I don't know? I mean, this actually what's just occurred to me is this happens in the fields of practice, and it happens at conferences. You look at 99.9% of panels at any conference for change practitioners, org development, org design, and so on and so forth. And if there's a question from the audience, because they're still typically done as panels of experts, which is another one of my issues, rather than actually crafting spaces for inquiry, we'll put these people on a pedestal because they clearly are the best people.
Yeah.
And then we ask them these questions, and then, like, Sermon from the Mount, they give us their responses. And I remember vividly at an HR conference, a very senior, I don't know what it was, his expert lead or something in a panel, somebody asked him a question from the front couple of rows, and he took a breath, and he said, it's a good question. What do you think? And it was done in a real kind of spirit of, he may have had an answer, but he wasn't going to collude with that. And that is what, for me, is missing, is that moment of dialogue. It's one of the issues, just to jump into a different space. One of my big critiques of how organizations look to build change capability is they typically see it as something that a group of specialists will do, either existing or ones that we want to develop. We then put them through a potentially wonderful program, because clearly all the programs I do with building consultants are all wonderful, they're all brilliant, obviously. But anyway, you put them through whatever program you've got, and they come out the other end all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and some of them really come out the other end absolutely. I mean, I've seen some superb practice emerge from some of these things. But then rarely, if ever, do I hear a senior leadership team, when they commission this work, going, yeah, maybe we might want to consider what capabilities we need to build in parallel to these people who we're asking to go and develop all these skills. And the other absolute indictment of the way that organizations do this, I never hear senior leaders then going, yeah, so we're asking these people to be responsible for facilitating and delivering and doing this stuff. We might want to think about having regular communication and conversations with them. It tends to be either fire and forget, they go and thunder off into the hills to do it, or it'll be the HRD, the CPO, or the director of OD, somebody in that space who is shepherdess-like or shepherd-like, is looking after their metaphorical chain sheepdogs as they kind of go off and try and herd people in the organisation, whilst off in the nearby pub or somewhere else, the senior leaders wonder why things maybe are not going quite as well as they could do, getting the occasional report from the front line. I mean, if I'm sounding a bit cynical, it's because, you know, I absolutely get why it is challenging and why you might want to subcontract or to ask other people to take something on. But there's a difference between delegating authority and responsibility and abdicating responsibility.
Yeah, I hard agree on all of that. I think I one of the drums that I bang about change is that it's too one directional. It's advocacy for the change rather than inquiry about why it's needed and what people think about it. And that conversation is missing. It's just all that trying to convince people why it's a good idea.
Yeah.
So much effort put into that rather than why are we doing it and what does it mean to people and do they really understand and what are their issues and does this change help them solve the issue? You know, it's that sort of thing that's missing, and it's all sort of from on high, and not giving people the capability in the organisation just to do change themselves rather than having to have specialists involved.
Yeah, and then, you know, the word capability is interesting. I use it a lot. You know, it's on my website, it's on my LinkedIn profile. Build change capability, and there's a very conscious collusion on my part, which is, you know, what's the language that is going to be close enough to what an organisation thinks it needs. But when we talk about change capability, what do we actually mean? So what rings in my mind is an interview I did with as part of a diagnostic phase about 4 years ago with a senior leader in a very big UK organisation, and we were talking about what was it they wanted the people about to do this consultancy program. What do they need to learn? And he said, we need them to operate at several grades above their pay level, and it stayed with me ever since. If you extrapolate for a moment, so what does that mean? So they need to operate at the level of senior leaders, which I would assume, if we're talking about an idealized notion of senior leadership, they need to be very good at communicating. They need to be very good at relationships. They need to be very good at influencing, ninja level at working through differences in conflict, have a strategic mindset, whatever the hell that is. They need to navigate power and politics elegantly. And so do all of that to the level of senior leaders and be paid substantially less, but without actually the positional authority that their senior leaders have. And that has always struck me as just such a wonderful contradiction.
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot to unpack in that, isn't there? Because also there's the whole question about, well, what does that actually mean? You know, what are they doing that's different, and why is it that way? You know, why is that how the expectation?
Well, I have a hypothesis. You know, it comes from something. So Eva Applebaum, who's a wonderful consultant practitioner, she's worked in senior levels in organizations, in consulting firms, in large organizations doing technology-driven change, so digital stuff, digitalization. And a few years ago, when we were talking about how her practice relates to organizational development, what was the similarities and differences? You know, she never talks about herself as being OD. That's again another example of how the absurdity of the labels we have for practice. And I remember her vividly talking to me about one of the biggest challenges working with boards when it came to doing stuff around technology is, well, 2 points. Firstly, often they are making incredibly large buying decisions. So signing off large invoices for things they simply do not understand. Secondly, how difficult it is to have the conversation about the fact they do not understand. And there we then start to move into the shame bit and the anxiety, the thing you talked about earlier on, which is the not knowing. So in order for that conversation to happen, the one about we need these people to operate at several grades above their pay level, we need to start talking about the things that are really uncomfortable. And just as an aside, the one group it was very hard to get to talk to me doing my research was CEOs. It's the next bit of research I want to do is around how shame drives decision making and patterns of behaviour in particularly within the CEO role, and it's really not talked about.
No, I mean, I think, and it's a fascinating area. To be honest, when I read your book, I hadn't really thought about it in that way. I knew that there was this issue around an unwillingness to be challenged and an unwillingness to be asked questions in case they didn't know the answer. And also I observe an unwillingness to experience emotion as well, that huge fear of, well, what if I say this and someone becomes angry or they cry and I don't know how to deal with it? But you put it so succinctly, when there is that anxiety about being held to account, but also of shame of being exposed. And I find that fascinating. I wonder how you'll get on with that research, whether people will talk to you. Or they might do it anonymously, maybe.
Well, but I think they'll need to do it anonymously. It would take a very brave senior leader to say, no, I'll go public. And I totally get that. There's a bit of research I mentioned in the book it's from the late 90s, but I don't think it will have changed that much now. From somebody who did research with senior leaders and found that the thing that 19 out of 20 of them feared the most was their employees finding out how inadequate they felt.
Yeah.
So, there's some phenomenal stories in the book in the 10th chapter from a British consultant now based in North America, Kashmir Berg, where the shame that rolls around within the senior leadership space is just front and center and can be seen to drive decision-making behaviors and costing hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah, I found one of the stories that I think it was he told in the book about how it was clear a project wasn't viable, and yet the shame of closing it was worse than spending millions of pounds on something that was nonsensical.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the thread dangling from this is our comfort with being wrong.
Yes.
Which is the thing that Catherine Schultz talks about in her book Being Wrong, which is how often do you hear somebody say unequivocally and unashamedly, very intentional use of the language, I'm wrong. I know it, I'm wrong. It's not that often in my experience. I practice a lot in my marriage with my daughter.
I think it's something we all need to be doing. But you're right, it's rare. And I think, as you say, the words you use are right. They're unequivocal. Even if someone does admit they're wrong, there's usually some kind of condition attached or a reason why. And I think it's interesting to think of occasions like that. When you were talking earlier about the panel, some years ago, I asked some people I was working with to tell me some stories about the organisations that they'd worked in and where they'd seen really good leadership. And one that's always stuck with me was a guy said he'd worked, I think it was in Transport for London or London Transport or something like that, the London Underground, and said that someone new had come in a very senior role. And, as happens with these things, they're all invited to some town hall meeting to pose questions to this guy. And this person I was speaking to had asked a question, and the new leader thought about it for a minute and said, I don't know. I haven't been here long enough, but I will find out and I will come back to you. And he did. And a few days later, contacted this guy directly. I've looked into it. This is what I've discovered. And that had happened years before. But for this person, that had stuck with them for years as an example of great leadership. And as you were talking about the panel and the person saying, oh, I don't know, what do you think? That popped into my mind as just as such an example, but I think it sticks out because it's so rare.
No, it is rare. And I've just my head's gone for some reason to my experience of the education system in my daughter's last school, her secondary school in Brighton, and the headmaster of that school, and that the kind of leadership culture there. My experience of that is of one that found it unbearable to say they'd made a mistake or got something wrong until after they'd been backed into a corner and there was no other way. And again, that's where, you know, what are the teenagers and kids in that school learning?
Mm. Yeah, I think it's because, and you see it everywhere in politics, in, as you say, CEOs, leadership of big organizations, small organizations, this unwillingness to ever be wrong is at the root of so much of this destructive behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's why Rory Stewart's autobiography is so fascinating, because he's actually talks about very much about shame and his own fragility, his own what's the word? The words escaping, but you know, his own acceptance that he's not perfect, his own imperfections, but how that contrasts with what he describes as a culture and a leadership culture within government that is utterly unable to countenance any acceptance that you could make a mistake.
And you see that in language, don't you, around politics, that there's so much in the press around when a person or a party makes a U-turn, and it's seen as such a negative thing by the press and other parties. Whereas I always think, well, actually, isn't that a good thing if they've realised that something they were doing was wrong and now they're doing something else? I would see that as something to be celebrated rather than something to be criticised for.
But there's the kind of collusion between us as the general populace and as employees and organisations. Now, how okay are we with keeping senior leaders on who go, I've made a mistake, we've made a mistake, should we learn from it? And we don't let them.
No.
So how are we ever going to learn? So my kind of sympathy with us as employees and as members of the wider population, you know, as that entity is, you know, goes to a certain point, but then it's like, well, we are collectively still a bit addicted to and sucking up to notions of heroic leadership.
Yeah, yeah, it's such an interesting puzzle, isn't it? That even, you know, I'm thinking now about my own feelings, and whilst I can be very supportive of U-turns, I feel like I would reach a point where I'd think there'd been too many, and I would see that as a sign of weakness. So yeah, you're right. It's beholden on all of us, isn't it, actually, to challenge ourselves and change our thinking and our practice.
You know, lurking in all this stuff, you know, bring it back to kind of the stuff that I'm kind of noodling on in the book. Lurking in here is the power stuff.
Yeah.
How power is exercised and who exercises it. It's stuff that Mark Cole talks about very eloquently in terms of, you know, who is being silenced in organisations, but also more widely, how is power used to keep people in a certain place. But also, it's not just about leaders keeping keeping others down, but the way power works to keep them in their place. It's not possible for them to break out of particular ways of being and doing, because collectively there isn't enough permission to allow leaders to behave in a way that is different to a certain set of norms. There are some notable exceptions. There are occasionally people who blip up, but they're not the ones that we tend to hear that much about. But they tend to be regarded as oddities. So, for example, what's his name? Is it Dale Vince, the guy who runs the green energy company?
Oh, yes.
You know, interesting man in terms of how he shows up. You know, he shows up as somebody who's made a lot of money, is a leader, but talks across a range of topics that go beyond the organizational boundary, and how uncomfortable that is to being him, because he won't fit in a box.
Yeah, I think you're right. There are the odd example, but that idea of the heroic leadership model is still so well embedded. I found myself writing a piece recently about the hero's journey, and that as a story structure. And for a long time, I thought, oh, it's really great, you know. And then you start to look at it in a bit more detail, and then you're like, oh, I don't know whether that feels quite right as a thing that we should be writing about, here's something to think about. It feels like it's too much in that model, doesn't it?
I suppose, but one of the threads or things that I'm thinking about now I finished the book is, I mean, there is a bit of a thing about the heroic consultant. You know, and what I mean by this, there's two sides to this. There's one as the projection onto the consultant as a savior, you know, come in as the expert and save us. So there we go. There's the heroic archetype of the consultant. And we know that there's that kind of the whole consulting modes thing of expert pair of hands and collaborative partner, fine. But what I think gets missed a little bit is some of the critiques of conventional leadership development, which I think are entirely valid, and I stand by my criticisms of the field. And I think it's something that Richard Hale says in the book, and maybe there was somebody else who may have said something else similar, is that much leadership development, and therefore the people who are delivering it, people like me, as I have done in the past, it is performative. We are invited in to perform for clients, often in very lush surroundings, and we are invited to bring our expertise and our knowledge about a model or models of leadership that are going to offer a template for people that they then somehow are supposed to absorb, have tattooed on their necks like a barcode, and then they go back out into the world and somehow they're transformed. Well, we know that doesn't work. So, and I also recognize that there's plenty of moments in my career doing that kind of work where I felt the strokes. I felt the invitation to be put into the place of expert, to perform as somebody who has the answer when it comes to leadership. And nowadays, the more strokes I get from a group, the more suspicious I get. Now, there's a rider on this, is two riders actually. Well, one, I really like being stroked.
Yeah, don't we all?
There's some people who, when I do appreciative work with groups, it's rare that you get people in a group, many of them saying, oh, I really love appreciation. Most people get really uncomfortable. I love it. Anybody wants to say something nice to me, knock themselves out. If anybody listening to this wants to email me and tell me something nice about me, I'm all in. Why wouldn't I be? I have had a client group recently, a lovely group, and they were just, so complimentary and appreciative and saying lovely things. And part of me was going, this is too good. Or, one of you, please tell me you hate what we've done. Come on, just somebody tell me this has not met your expectations. But simultaneously, I look at them as a group and my goodness me, they're going away and doing their work. And they're one of the most reflexive groups I've ever worked with. What's the word? The unconscious capability and in some cases conscious competence that they had was magnificent. And now they're just going off and I think they're flying into varying degrees. So I don't want to discount that sometimes we can get stroked appropriately. And when are we being invited in to take some kind of heroic position as a expert?
That's a really interesting thought, isn't it? Because I think I was looking at something the other day. It was on LinkedIn, and someone was sharing the feedback that people had given them immediately, like post course or post development. And I was like, yeah, that's just, people just say nice things, don't they? Because people are nice and polite, and it's hard to say to someone, I didn't like what you did. But actually, if we're doing the work, the proper work, as you said earlier, you would quite like people to go, I found that really hard, or that really challenged me, or I didn't like that. That's, I think back to my own development experience, and I did a program at years ago at Surrey University. I did like a facilitation skills postgraduate thing. And I can remember it was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. And I've spent most of the time being exceptionally angry about what was happening to me. However, I learned more from that than probably anything that I've done since. And I think at the time I can remember stomping home and just being like, oh. But it's because it was unpicking something deep within me, which I found uncomfortable. And I think at the time I didn't understand it. I was still quite young and it all felt a bit weird. But looking back on it later, it's one of the most impactful things I've ever done. I've done dozens of things since then, which I enjoyed, but I don't think they've stuck with me in quite the same way. And I think as a consultant, it is that challenge, isn't it? Because you do want people to like what you're doing. And there is something rather nice about being rolled out as, here's Susanne. She's going to come and talk to us about X, Y, and Z. But you also want to make a difference. And I think it's that is the balancing act, isn't it, really?
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, it relates to what I talk about in the book, which is, I don't deny at all that if you engage with some of the things that I'm raising questions about, it's not necessarily going to be that comfortable. It might be, in some cases, it can be really exciting and energizing. There's some of the questions I ask, I think are really energizing. They can be very positive. But some of them are invitations to go into places that are a little bit squeaky, a bit messy. But as I think I say in the book, my own experience is most things in life that you've learned that have any real significance have often been preceded by a degree of discomfort. As you rightly say, it's the things you remember that you've learned from. You probably had to, it's like, oh my God, it's that, oh.
Yeah, exactly. I liked, you mentioned the word collusion earlier, and I think that what I found so fascinating in the book is, I think you call it functional collusion, about between on the part of the client and the consultant to create this issue. And you've got the consciousness of some consultancy firms of needing to fund their great machine, which is enormous and has lots of people in it. And then you go, it's back to that shame and anxiety on the part of the client to need to have that solution to their problem, and the shame of not knowing themselves. And I think that I found that so fascinating. And if anything, that was the bit that I was smiling at with recognition the most, recognizing that from my entire consultancy career, but also thinking then about the challenge as a consultant of how you resolve that in your own relationships with clients, because you do want to be useful and solve the problem. And I think it's that, for me, is the part that's challenging as a consultant, is how do you move your relationships with your clients to a different level?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, but even in that, so let's just unpack that for a moment. So we take the language of moving a relationship with your client to a different level. What level are we trying to move it to?
Yes. I don't know. I suppose a more equal is what I was thinking, but even that's probably problematic.
But then we're then into, why is it certain clients choose to work with certain consultants? And there is this thing about, beautifully described by one of my clients, about senior leaders on her board having their own consultant from a major firm whispering in their ear.
Yes.
And there's somebody else who comments about how the behaviour of senior leaders changing totally when somebody from McKinsey's walked in the room.
Yeah.
It's so I guess I'm chewing in the moment around, so what kind of relationships do I want with my clients? I've got clients that I've worked with. Some of I'm still in touch with after years, and there's others I'm not. Some have moved into a space where I count them as friends, and I may still do work with them occasionally, or might in the future. The question is, does that in any way mean that I won't do with them what I would with a client I know less well? Is the question I'm asking myself. And once I've moved somebody into a space where, I like you now as a human being, and I'll hang out with you at some point, if we move that into the work context, am I going to hold back at all? I don't have an intent to. I guess the potential jeopardy is increased. I might lose a friend. But then again, that's the relationality of it. I'm reminded of something my supervisor said to me a couple of years ago. She said, it's an absolute myth that people in the senior leadership teams, but arguably in relationships between consultants and clients, that they need to like each other.
Yes.
They need to respect each other, but they don't need to like each other. But I recognise in me, it goes back to the thing about being stroked. Of course I want to be with people I like.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's nice sometimes to work with clients who you do develop a really strong relationship with, but equally it's good sometimes to work with clients that you find really challenging, I think, and then to try and unpack why it is like that. Is it just that they're very different from you, or is it that they're challenging you to work with them in a different way? I think that's the question.
But in that, we could get really psychological on this, which is, sometimes we're attracted to people for all the wrong reasons.
Yes.
We like, it's the using the TA thing about the Cartman drama triangle. We have unconscious patterns of being victim, persecutor, or rescuer. That shows up in organisations.
Of course it does.
that can show up in client relationships. Do I get attracted to a client because I want to rescue them? If I just pause for a moment, are there clients I've wanted to rescue? Certainly felt the pull.
Yeah,
Definitely.
oh yeah, definitely. Me too.
Certainly felt the pull. But there's this is where I think the shame thing is interesting. If you really do start to reflect on your relationship with clients, there's something that Elliot Aram, who's the CEO of the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations, talks about in her work, which is there's a paradoxical nature to shame. It's developmental. The more we work with it, the more we learn. We don't want to talk about it because it's shame. So yeah, why am I saying that? I guess because I'm looping back to, I'm not unaware of the uncomfortable space I'm inviting readers to potentially have a fertile around it.
But I think it's a good space to be in. It's a necessary space to be in. I think that's the thing. It's you talked as well in the book, or at least when we've spoken before, and you mentioned it earlier. I think that the need for this is important, because in consulting, in comparison to coaching and other forms of development, there isn't that culture of supervision. So there isn't a space for people to engage with these things, because you, as a consultant, you go off and consult, but who do you talk to about how you're doing it? And I think it's a huge gap which needs to be filled. And I think the work that you're doing is part of that process.
Yeah, it's a. I mean, I'm still working that one through. There are a small group of people I know who are explicitly working on consulting supervision and want to do that work, but they are the exception. They are, people who, like me, primarily interested in consulting supervision and secondary in coaching. I mean, I will do absolutely coaching supervision, because I think the boundary is actually not as neat as saying I'm a coach.
No, definitely not.
But certainly starting from a place of creating supervisory spaces for people to explore and make sense of their consulting practice with very deliberately that frame, I don't think is that common. No. Which I find really interesting, because I mean, there's something I posted on LinkedIn this week. There's a piece of research that Roffey Park are doing around OD supervision, and I think it's great that there's somebody out there kind of saying, can we talk about supervision for OD practitioners? But my question would be and this is not for them, it's for all of us, well, where's the conversation about consulting supervision, period? Why is it that OD, which has got a very long history of taking a more, what's the word, values or ethically driven approach to thinking about its practice, why are other consulting disciplines and other consulting fields not in their spaces saying we might want to think about where we go to make sense of the crap that comes up in us and between us and our clients, rather than just carrying on trolling on doing the work? Where's that conversation?
Yeah, it's lacking. And I think I left the big consultancy firm some time ago, but even when I was there, it wasn't happening in that space. There was the obviously appraisals and performance management, and you had a line manager, but I don't recall there being much reflective practice in terms of how did that assignment go and what went well and what didn't go well. And I think, and as an independent consultant, there's even less spaces to have that conversation, because you might be connected to other independents through something like the Change Management Institute or a particular body, but again, there's not a huge amount of space to unpick some of that, I don't think.
But it goes back to this thing about you need to actually choose to go into that space and be open to the possibility of not be that comfortable. So what I noticed about the people who approach me to do one-to-one supervision is they tend to come, well, they're attracted to me because of how I show up, and they kind of have a sense that I'm actually going to ask them questions that might go beyond the obvious. But their part of this is they're kind of going, yeah, I kind of need to think more deeply about who I am and my practice and the relationship between the two. I need to go beyond the superficial and the obvious. I don't necessarily know what that means even. I just know I need to do it. And it's not therapy. Let's be really clear about this. It's not about, There's a clear, that for me, there's a clear line, between the two spaces. And I have my own way of framing what that is with clients. But it is a willingness to get usefully discomforted, and a recognition that you might need to be.
Yes. Well, I feel like that's the perfect place to stop our conversation, with an invitation to the listener to become usefully discomforted, however they may see fit. It's been really great talking to you today. I feel like I've learned a lot from our conversation.
Got me thinking. I've got more thoughts.
It's always good to leave a conversation with more thoughts. If people want to find out more about you and your book and your work, where's the best place for them to go and have a look?
Best thing to do, well, I suppose there's three obvious places. There's me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Steve Hearsum that I'm aware of on there, so it's very easy to find me. That's the joys of having a relatively unusual name. There's my kind of client-facing website, which is just to serve the purpose of framing what I do commercially, which is edgeandstretch.com. And there is hearsum.com, which is the best way I can describe it. It's probably a window into my brain. It's where I go a little bit more free range in how I show up. And the writing there it'll have some of the writing that I've done elsewhere, but there may also be some more irreverent stuff there. So those are the three main places I'd say where you can find out.
And your book's available now in all good bookshops. And
it will be after about 4 weeks. Once the various databases are updated. It takes a bit longer to do that, but it will be available through Waterstones and places like that.
Brilliant.
$15.99 for paperback, which is actually not bad these days.
That's a bargain. That is a bargain. Yeah. Everyone must go out and buy it. It's a really good read, I have to say. And I'm not saying that because I'm in it. It is genuinely a really good book. Steve, thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been an absolute joy. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Change Stories podcast. I love this conversation and I hope you did too. Thanks as ever to my wonderful guests and to Pete Morgan at Monkey Pants Productions for making the podcast sound amazing. If you want to find out more about this or any other episodes of Change Stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk, where you will find all the episodes and show notes. If you have enjoyed listening, please rate and review the Change Stories podcast on your podcast listening platform. And do please let me know if you have ideas or requests for future episodes. You can contact me and find out more about change and storytelling on my website, www.feldsparconsulting.com. Thanks again for joining in with the Change Stories conversation.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.